Serious injury of 533 people from lifeboats in the Gulf of Alaska.
The 533 passengers and crew members who were the object of one of the greatest sea rescues in history are now beginning to head home. Leaving their burning cruise ship behind, they carry with them an awareness that they're lucky to be alive.
On the weekend of October 4th, 523 people were rescued from the choppy waters of the Gulf of Alaska after they abandoned the burning cruise ship Prinsendam. This is the story of the Air Force's part in that effort.
It was about 3:30 in the morning, and I guess I probably was still a little bit asleep. So when I heard the call, I said, they said 540 people, and I said, "You really mean 5, don't you?" And no, he said 540, and I said, "Well, that's probably a mistake, but I'm on my way anyhow." So just grabbed my clothes in a hurry and headed on out, and we started flight planning, getting ready to leave. And then when we got out to the office here, we confirmed exactly what had happened with the RCC over the telephone.
They had the report from the Coast Guard that the Prinsendam had an engine fire, or a fire in the engine room, and that they had fired the CO2 bottles or CO2 fire extinguisher agent. The status of the fire was unknown at that time, and that they requested that we put some of our personnel on standby, primarily the pararescue personnel. We got a call from the Coast Guard again that the Prinsendam was abandoning ship at that point and that they were requesting helicopter support. We immediately called or contacted the alert crew for the helicopter, which was Captain Walters.
It actually took us a little over 3.5 hours before we finally arrived on scene and started doing some work. And part of that was we had to air refuel after getting into the area of Yakutat. We had to land at Yakutat and pick up 169 blankets, and then we finally went out to the Williamsburg for our first landing.
The Air Force helicopter picked up the remaining crew members from the Prinsendam and some people in lifeboats and transferred them to the oil tanker Williamsburg.
The aerial refueling portion, our capability, was just invaluable this time because it kept us on scene a long time. It was about an hour and 10 minutes or so from Yakutat on scene and then back again. So the Coast Guard birds spent a lot of time ferrying just so they could go back feet dry and refuel. Aerial refueling just really paid off for itself this time.
Our main purpose out there was to refuel the HH-3 helicopter from our squadron. Sergeant Collins picked up a call saying that he intercepted a call from between two other aircraft saying that there was a helicopter lost, and we were not really tasked at anything at that time to do anything special. So he called the on-scene commander, who was a Coast Guard aircraft, and asked them to confirm that there was a lost aircraft and if we could be of any assistance. He informed them that we had special equipment, that is a tracker and special radar gear on the aircraft that would aid us in finding this aircraft. At that point, the on-scene commander said, "Go ahead and do it. We'll take other aircraft that are on the search for that aircraft out, and you'll be responsible for searching for that aircraft." Within a matter of about 2 or 3 minutes after that, Sergeant Collins went down into the back of the aircraft to warm up his tracker and see if he can't lock onto a signal, which he did quite rapidly after getting into the back of the aircraft by his tracker. At that point, we tried all the different radios to contact them on, and we still weren't able to. And then finally, we found a radio frequency that he was on, and we asked him if he had us in sight, and he said no. So we started the whole thing again. Sergeant Collins and Colonel Tony directed me back toward him. I pulled in front of him again, and this time he said he had us in sight, and we started heading back north to take him out to Yakutat. At the time, the weather, we were at about 300 feet in and out of the clouds, and he was able to see the aircraft, but every now and then he would lose sight of it. So the loadmasters then had what we call an Altus lamp, or a bright spotlight. They were shining it out the window at the aircraft, which aided him in seeing our aircraft so that he could follow us. And we took him all the way then to Yakutat, at times going as low as 200 feet to stay out of the clouds enough where he could see us.
It all happened so quick. We really didn't have a chance. From the initial call to where I was down in the back, locating him on the tracker to station passage, all happened inside of 3 minutes, when it was fairly rapid. And it just went boom, boom, boom. And then we finally got him in tow, and we just proceeded back to Yakutat. During the mission, in some of the critical phases, I had a tough time maintaining communications with RCC who was controlling our aircraft, the Air Force aircraft out there. So I'd go to the airways frequencies, and because of being so low in the weather conditions, I couldn't get airways, but ADAC line maintenance came on, and they asked if they could help out, and I said yes, and I relayed over a period of 45 minutes a lot of traffic through ADAC, who relayed it to Elmendorf, to the RCC. And I'd just like to thank them guys at ADAC for doing a great job.
We looked at our fuel level, and as the 130 was escorting the distressed helicopter back to land, they advised us that there were higher headwinds than they had anticipated, and the weather was much worse. So even though we kind of had the fuel to make it, we let discretion rule us, and we decided there's a nice little tanker we can sit out on there and just wait for them. Well, unfortunately, it took them longer to get the helicopter back to Yakutak than they anticipated, and we sat on the deck burning more fuel than we thought we would. Make a long story short, we wound up short of fuel, and the weather was too bad for the 130 to get back out to us and refuel us. So with about 35 minutes of fuel left on board the helicopter, we just tied it down to the deck and shut it down, and got free passage to Valdez on board the ship.
Because of a low fuel situation and a broken hoist, the helicopter crew was forced to leave 2 pararescuemen and 18 other passengers in a lifeboat. The co-pilot, Captain Gillen, explains.
The PJs, we first of all deployed them to the boat, both of them, because we felt it was necessary to have someone in the boat assisting the people with the penetrator, and to get them on, strap them on properly. And because of the rough seas, it was very helpful to have another PJ there who could assist with the hoist and reach the cable when it was in the water. We had to ground it in the water first, and then he would help bring it to the boat. So we have both of them in the boat at that time. When we finished taking the last of the crew off of the Prinsendam, then we came back to the lifeboat where the PJs were, and we were going to take the PJs out and trade them out with Sergeant Tanner and another one, and put them back in the lifeboat to spell out the 2 PJs we'd left there. And as we were beginning that operation, we had the hoist down for the very first survivor. We were going to take some survivors at the same time while we were there. And they had 1 survivor just about on the penetrator, and because of the rough seas, a huge swell came up and lifted the boat up towards us, and the cable, the slack in the cable came down wrapped underneath the rudder of the lifeboat. And then the swell dropped out from under us, and Sergeant Ingalls was trying to feed slack as fast as he could, but it wasn't quite enough, and the boat came down, bottomed out, and it snapped the cable underneath the rudder. Well, at that time, then, there wasn't much we could do. It was really a disheartening feeling to look down at the boat, and the people they had the most pitiful looks on their faces at that time. So there wasn't much we could do at that time. We notified the others. They were in charge of the operation, and we thought sure, because of the other helicopters working, that they would see the lifeboat right there. It wasn't very far from the other lifeboats, and we thought sure that they would be picked up. And our main concern at that time was our fuel state and reaching a safe place to land.
Okay, we kept our PJs, both of them at that time. We had 1 in the boat to help them into the penetrator, and 1 into the water to get the penetrator. Because a lot of times you didn't want to get it too close to the boat, because the people on the boat, they didn't understand too much about it. They would grab for it, and they would grab the cable and that. And so we kept 1 PJ in the water to handle the penetrator.
And he is outfitted in a complete wetsuit, so that they...
Yes, sir. He had a unisuit on.
Okay, we mentioned 61 hoists. I understand you had a new pair of gloves with you.
Yes,
when you went down there.
My rescue hoist glove was brand new.
How long would a glove like that last? How many missions?
The last one I wore out took me 2 years. This one didn't last very long.
One lady, an 86-year-old woman, was the only one, I guess, to be dunked. Was that one of your hoists, or was that from the Coast Guard chopper?
The lady was in the penetrator, and we were about 25 feet to the after the boat, with a lot of slack in the cables to compensate for the swells. And we were pulling the slack back in, starting to reel her in, when the bottom dropped out on the swell, and she went over the side into the water. And at that time I went full up on the hoist, and the pilot pulled full collective on the aircraft, and she just hit the water and just momentarily, just as she was coming up.
And they picked me up, and instead of picking me up, they picked me down, and I went in the ocean. Everybody else got well, except me. It's the truth. I'm the only one who dropped the ocean.
First of all, we try to get them calm. That was a big important part because of the fact that you had people there that were shouting, and everybody else was, they said they forgot us, and we told them that, don't worry, they'll be back for us, and we know rescue. We've been with it for quite a while, and there's no way they were going to let us down, and all we had to do was get them to rely on us, and toward the end, after even, it got dark and they didn't see the boats or nothing around, they got a little panicky, but once we, put the tarp up and got them warm and everything, and everybody kind of settled down and kind of fell asleep, and they got their warmth, what they needed, and they were okay. There was food on the boat, there was water, there was everything in there, and really, there wasn't any problem as far as being there to staying longer than expected.
Well, there was nobody in our group that was in panic. When you're out in a boat and you're lonely and people are worried and thinking things, they start coming out and they just say things to make them feel better. And some of them says, well, why don't you shoot off your flares or use your radio and stuff like that? And I sort of explained it that we need this stuff for better use than what was at the time, the situation warranted at the time.
When we arrived to the tanker, we were greeted by one of the Coast Guard people who were there and told us that there was a lot of people in every crook and cranny all over the ship, and that we should probably look and appraise the situation before we did anything specific, which is what we did. All of us, the three that was pararescue guys that was with me, we started through the ship just to see what was going on. Found a lot of people, some who were hypothermic apparently, most of which were in surprisingly pretty good shape at that point. We found people who were unable to make sense when we'd ask them questions, who were unable to give us a numerical order from 1 to 10, who did not know the Social Security number, who could not spell their name for us, who obviously were beyond the shivering stage, which by diagnosis and by definition is hypothermic. Those people were pretty critical. They were rapidly approaching a point where they were not reversible to bring them back to normal, what we call, normal life. So from the temperatures that we were able to take, we were looking at temperatures of 89 and 90, which is a fairly critical temperature for elderly people. So we simply started warming these people up and hydrating them and putting warm liquids in them, and incredible as it seems, they came back without all the unusual complications we were anticipating. We had 3 pararescue people. The Canadians had 3 pararescue people, equivalent trained. We had troopers, firefighters, and some Sitka EMT trained people, all of which are people that we've dealt with at various times in the past, either in rescues or, for whatever reason. So we knew each other. So it was just a simple matter of saying, hey, John, I know that I need these things, and we were on a first-name basis, and it worked very nicely that way.
Well, to tell you the truth, we had a lot of cooperation from the patients, and we didn't get a lot of complaining. Everybody was in a state of shock, and there was very little panic at all from the patients themselves, and we were able to keep everything pretty well orderly. We had some Canadian people out there, and we had some EMTs from Sitka that were out there, and ourselves, of course. And we were able to organize everything into a small infirmary using the mess hall on board the ship. And that's where all the patients were located.
We were up quite late, mostly wondering what happened to the other 2 guys that were still out in the water. And the crew gave up their rooms, so we did get to lay down for a while. They did an outstanding job. I think if you're going to really hand it to anybody, you would have to hand it to the crew of that ship.
I gotta tell you, the U.S. of A. is just a great place. The Air Force, the Canadians, the Coast Guard.
The tanker,
just seeing them after being out in that lifeboat in the dark.
Was it cold out there?
Oh, and Alaska Sound, yes.
It was a team effort, though. We've talked about individual duties in here, and I'd like to stress this, and this is true on every mission we fly. It's everyone working together that gets this particular type of job done. It's someone suggesting something perhaps that someone else that might normally have thought about it didn't happen to think of at the time. Or it's the crew working together that really makes a mission like this click, and it makes a successful mission.
And I love the United States government. Thank you.
What are you going to do now?
I'd like to get a pair of bloomers. I didn't come off with them.
I'd sure like to have somebody say thank you to this Ohio Intrepid. Everybody knows that Williamsburg was out there, but as far as I'm concerned, if it hadn't been for that ship, we might have got wet.
I'm quoting a passenger, was that I've got all of my house in order. I've done everything that I want to do, and my kids are raised, and everything's fine. Of course, I don't want to die, and I'm going to do everything I can to prevent it. But if I do, you know, there's not that big a problem. And that was his quote, not mine. And it seemed to be, you know, that was an attitude that was fairly prevalent. You know, they were very helpful, but not panicky, and not a hazard to us. Very cooperative.
From New York City, from Hollywood, this week from Caesar Palace in Las Vegas, it's the Merv Griffin Show.
I have such trouble getting this guy into show business all the time.
I was just in show business.
I know you were in show business. Every time I turned on the television for 3 days, I saw nothing but you on the news. Roger was one of the survivors of that boat fire up there in Alaska.
Yeah, we sure were.
You sure were.
It was, thank you. That was quite
It was the actual act that sunk the boat. And,
well, I've got one of those marimbas now in 9,000 feet of water.
Oh, have you really?
And it was quite an experience. It was. We were in the lifeboats, I'd say about 15 hours, about 30-foot seas, 50 knot winds.
Right.
But I'll tell you, one thing that's very interesting about that ship, it's not a boat, it's a ship. It was a Prinsendam, Holland American Lines. And one thing that was very interesting was not one single life was lost.
Right.
The lieutenant on a Coast Guard cutter.
How many people?
Oh, there were 520, I think, and 519 myself.
Any great panicking among the people?
Not a single thing. But the Coast Guard cutter, oh, thank God for the United States Coast Guard, and thank God for the Canadian Coast Guard,
right.
And the Alaskan people. I'll tell you one thing. There was a lieutenant on that Coast Guard that said, because of the crew and the training of the crew, and because the ship was built so well, that's why there was no loss of life. In addition to that, that captain, his name was Wabiki, and also another hotel manager there, Zeller. They had those lifeboats at the ready long before he said abandon ship. And if you ever you read about it, you see yourself out in or you see other people in being picked up into a helicopter, but it's an experience. Getting and watching that ocean leave you, and you say, thank God.
15 hours in the
15 hours in the lifeboat.
Then how do they get you out of those?
Out of the helicopter.
Took everybody out.
They took everybody out, and I can't begin to tell you how nice those little old ladies and those little old men reacted. No panic, no nothing. Just sat there shivering to death, but no complaining, nothing.
Eventually, will someone dive down 9,000 feet and get your xylophone back?
I hope so. This is the second
Probably
one in the
Mrs.
water.
Ray, won't it?
No, this is the second one in the water. Isn't that funny? I've got one in the Atlantic and one in the Pacific.
Well, folks, if you see him on the passenger list of any ship you're boarding, I'd advise you to get right off. Roger, a delight to welcome you back to land, and great to have you on the stage. Roger Ray. We'll be right back after this message.
Okay, well, we obviously got more than 3 rafts already, so some of those obviously did break off.
Bernard Goldberg.
It began as a pleasure cruise and ended abruptly as a nightmare at sea. The 427-foot Prinsendam en route from Canada to the Orient when a fire broke out in the boiler room, then spread, turning the deluxe luxury liner into a burning disaster, dead in the cold, choppy waters of the Gulf of Alaska. Some 500 passengers and crew abandoned ship, some of them bobbing in lifeboats for 12 hours and longer. But everyone was rescued, plucked from their lifeboats by the Coast Guard. The passengers who arrived in Sitka, a small town along the southern Alaskan coast, said their ordeal was wet, cold, and at times frightening.
The Prinsendam just drifted off by itself, and we drifted off in another direction.
It sounds eerie.
Yes, it does, and it was pitch black out there. It was terribly cold. It was terribly cold, and I was sopping wet. There was no cover over the lifeboat, and we were all sopping wet.
Well, first it wasn't bad, but after a few hours, I said, "Dear Lord, I don't mind going, but it's a nasty way to go."
When my wife went up in the helicopter, tear rolled down my cheek, and I thought that'd be the last time I'd ever see her. And it just didn't look like there was enough time to get everybody out. The seas were rising.
We were getting a little nervous. Particularly my husband and I, we didn't have our life jackets, and then they said, what difference does it make if you go overboard? You can only last in these Alaskan waters maybe less than 15 minutes.
And late yesterday afternoon, a Coast Guard cutter arrived in Sitka carrying some of the last passengers picked from the ocean.
I didn't think you'd be coming. I thought you'd be at
I knew. What everyone was poignantly aware of is that this drama at sea might have ended tragically, with many deaths. As it was, there were only a few relatively minor medical problems. Some passengers suffered from exposure to the cold, wet weather. Mrs. Solomon was at dockside too, waiting for her husband.
He's okay. He's in Valdez.
As frightening as it was for the passengers, they are all aware that it could have been far worse. So now, with the rescue operation completed, officials are turning to the question of how it all began in the first place. Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Sitka, Alaska.
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
It was the kind of drama about which sagas of the sea are written. The weekend rescue of more than 500 passengers and crew from the flaming cruise ship Prinsendam. That adventure in the snarled and yelping seas of the Gulf of Alaska after fire broke out in the engine room is being called the greatest single ship rescue in recent history. All aboard were accounted for with no major injuries after rescue efforts led by the Coast Guard, and one rescuer called that a miracle. Bernard Goldberg reports.
The fire that broke out before dawn on Saturday was still smoldering below deck today. The 427-foot Dutch liner, the Prinsendam, still dead in the water. Yesterday, smoke was pouring out of the ship, which is drifting, listing slightly, but the hull is in good shape, and unless the weather worsens significantly, probably not in danger of sinking. Today, the ship's captain, Cornelius Babeka, a Dutchman, and other officials of the Holland-American line boarded a helicopter en route to the Prinsendam, where Captain Babeka was once again to take command. But the waves were too high, they did not board the ship, which soon will be towed southward towards Washington State for repairs. Meanwhile, in Sitka, a small fishing village nestled beneath the mountains of southern Alaska, a high-ranking official of the cruise line, a former captain of the Prinsendam himself, talked for the first time about what went wrong.
We closed it off and sealed it off right away, the engine room. Let in the gas, the fire extinguisher and CO2 gas. And from that time on, the fire in the engine room started simmering down. But of course there was heat conveyance from the engine room casing, and that must have caused maybe curtains or whatever in the dining room just by heat conveyance to catch fire, and that's how it got outside the engine room. At least that's my best guess.
The stark realization is that this cruise that ended in disaster might have become a far worse tragedy with many deaths at sea. And today, officials of the cruise line began assessing the damage to determine if they can salvage the ship, restore it, and once again take it out to sea as a luxury liner. Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Sitka, Alaska.
But late this evening, it appeared that damage may be extensive, perhaps fatal to the ship. The Coast Guard reported that smoke and flames had erupted over the vessel, and it feared the fuel tanks may have caught fire. Passengers today mixed their praise for the rescue effort with criticism of the crew's behavior. Susan Spencer reports from Valdez, Alaska.
Valdez's main department store was doing a booming business this morning as Prinsendam passengers, most still clad in their lifeboat clothes, tried to make themselves presentable for the flight home, courtesy Holland America Lines.
Do you have anything else? I mean, I'd like your pantsuit better.
At the nearby Totem Inn, there were but two topics of conversation: what happened on the Prinsendam and how did I ever make it?
Well, I wasn't really frightened. We have done a lot of trusting in our lives. And the only time it was really terrifying was when we were hitting the side of the ship and we thought that the boat would turn over because the water at 44 degrees or something like that, you don't last very long. And the waves were so high.
There were mixed reviews for the captain's performance through all this, but no kudos at all for the 106 Indonesian crew members, who passengers said clambered into lifeboats first.
There was a bunch of fellas from the band on the boat, and they were all lined around the rail where they shouldn't be. And then when he said to the abandoned ship, a bunch of the crew members, this is the Indonesian crew members, and this band bunch, they just jumped right in and nobody else could get near the boat. When the helicopters eventually came, which was about 11 hours later, you know who was first off the boat. And we couldn't keep them, and so Cora said, "Let them go, we're better off without them, get them out of here." That was the band, this crew and the band. But it was terrible. They were walking all over the little old ladies, and it was a shame.
The flares and things are either whether they're written in English and they can't read it, and they didn't know how to use them anyway. They had had no training in this. They didn't know how to release us from the boat. They didn't know how to start the oars.
The crew, busy on the town volleyball court, showed no sign of concern over all this criticism, nor would anyone talk about the Prinsendam incident. By the time the passengers arrived at the Valdez airport for the last leg of their journey, they seemed equally uninterested in dissecting it. As one man said, "Let them figure it out. I just want to get out of here." Susan Spencer, CBS News, Valdez, Alaska.
It was the kind of drama about which sagas of the sea are written. The weekend rescue of more than 500 passengers and crew from the flaming cruise ship Prinsendam. That adventure in the snarled and yelping seas of the Gulf of Alaska after fire broke out in the engine room is being called the greatest single ship rescue in recent history. All aboard were accounted for with no major injuries after rescue efforts led by the Coast Guard, and one rescuer called that a miracle. Bernard Goldberg reports.
The fire that broke out before dawn on Saturday was still smoldering below deck today. The 427-foot Dutch liner, the Prinsendam, still dead in the water. Yesterday, smoke was pouring out of the ship, which is drifting, listing slightly, but the hull is in good shape, and unless the weather worsens significantly, probably not in danger of sinking. Today, the ship's captain, Cornelius Babeka, a Dutchman, and other officials of the Holland American Line boarded a helicopter en route to the Prinsendam, where Captain Babeka was once again to take command. But the waves were too high, they did not board the ship, which soon will be towed southward towards Washington State for repairs. Meanwhile, in Sitka, a small fishing village nestled beneath the mountains of southern Alaska, a high-ranking official of the cruise line, a former captain of the Prinsendam himself, talked for the first time about what went wrong.
We closed it off and sealed it off right away, the engine room. Let in the gas, the fire extinguisher and CO2 gas, and from that time on, the fire in the engine room started simmering down. But of course there was heat conveyance from the engine room casing, and that must have caused maybe curtains or whatever in the dining room just by heat conveyance to catch fire, and that's how it got outside the engine room. At least that's my best guess.
The stark realization is that this cruise that ended in disaster might have become a far worse tragedy with many deaths at sea. And today, officials of the cruise line began assessing the damage to determine if they can salvage the ship, restore it, and once again take it out to sea as a luxury liner. Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Sitka, Alaska.
But late this evening, it appeared that damage may be extensive, perhaps fatal to the ship. The Coast Guard reported that smoke and flames had erupted over the vessel, and it feared the fuel tanks may have caught fire. Passengers today mixed their praise for the rescue effort with criticism of the crew's behavior. Susan Spencer reports from Valdez, Alaska.
Valdez's main department store was doing a booming business this morning as Prinsendam passengers, most still clad in their lifeboat clothes, tried to make themselves presentable for the flight home, courtesy Holland America Lines.
Do you have anything else? I mean, I'd like your pantsuit better.
At the nearby Totem Inn, there were but two topics of conversation: what happened on the Prinsendam and how did I ever make it?
Well, I wasn't really frightened. We have done a lot of trusting in our lives. And the only time it was really terrifying was when we were hitting the side of the ship and we thought that the boat would turn over, because the water at 44 degrees or something like that, you don't last very long, and the waves were so high.
There were mixed reviews for the captain's performance through all this, but no kudos at all for the 106 Indonesian crew members, who passengers said clambered into lifeboats first.
There was a bunch of fellas from the band on the boat, and they were all lined around the rail where they shouldn't be. And then when he said they'd abandoned ship, a bunch of the crew members, this is the Indonesian crew members, and this band bunch, they just jumped right in and nobody else could get near the boat. When the helicopters eventually came, which was about 11 hours later, you know who was first off the boat. And we couldn't keep them, and so Cora said, "Let them go, we're better off without them, get them out of here." That was the band, this crew and the band. But it was terrible. They were walking all over the little old ladies, and it was a shame.
The flares and things are either whether they're written in English and they can't read it, and they didn't know how to use them anyway. They had had no training in this. They didn't know how to release us from the boat. They didn't know how to start the oars.
The crew, busy on the town volleyball court, showed no sign of concern over all this criticism, nor would anyone talk about the Prinsendam incident. By the time the passengers arrived at the Valdez airport for the last leg of their journey, they seemed equally uninterested in dissecting it. As one man said, "Let them figure it out. I just want to get out of here." Susan Spencer, CBS News, Valdez, Alaska.
It was the kind of drama about which sagas of the sea are written. The weekend rescue of more than 500 passengers and crew from the flaming cruise ship Prinsendam. That adventure in the snarled and yelping seas of the Gulf of Alaska after fire broke out in the engine room is being called the greatest single ship rescue in recent history. All aboard were accounted for with no major injuries after rescue efforts led by the Coast Guard, and one rescuer called that a miracle. Bernard Goldberg reports.
The fire that broke out before dawn on Saturday was still smoldering below deck today. The 427-foot Dutch liner, the Prinsendam, still dead in the water. Yesterday, smoke was pouring out of the ship, which is drifting, listing slightly, but the hull is in good shape, and unless the weather worsens significantly, probably not in danger of sinking. Today, the ship's captain, Cornelius Babeka, a Dutchman, and other officials of the Holland American Line boarded a helicopter en route to the Prinsendam, where Captain Babeka was once again to take command. But the waves were too high, they did not board the ship, which soon will be towed southward towards Washington State for repairs. Meanwhile, in Sitka, a small fishing village nestled beneath the mountains of southern Alaska, a high-ranking official of the cruise line, a former captain of the Prinsendam himself, talked for the first time about what went wrong.
We closed it off and sealed it off right away, the engine room. Let in the gas, the fire extinguisher and CO2 gas, and from that time on, the fire in the engine room started simmering down. But of course there was heat conveyance from the engine room casing, and that must have caused maybe curtains or whatever in the dining room just by heat conveyance to catch fire, and that's how it got outside the engine room. At least that's my best guess.
The stark realization is that this cruise that ended in disaster might have become a far worse tragedy with many deaths at sea. And today, officials of the cruise line began assessing the damage to determine if they can salvage the ship, restore it, and once again take it out to sea as a luxury liner. Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Sitka, Alaska.
But late this evening, it appeared that damage may be extensive, perhaps fatal to the ship. The Coast Guard reported that smoke and flames had erupted over the vessel, and it feared the fuel tanks may have caught fire. Passengers today mixed their praise for the rescue effort with criticism of the crew's behavior. Susan Spencer reports from Valdez, Alaska.
Valdez's main department store was doing a booming business this morning as Prinsendam passengers, most still clad in their lifeboat clothes, tried to make themselves presentable for the flight home, courtesy Holland America Lines.
Do you have anything else? I mean, I'd like your pantsuit better.
At the nearby Totem Inn, there were but two topics of conversation: what happened on the Prinsendam and how did I ever make it?
Well, I wasn't really frightened. We have done a lot of trusting in our lives. And the only time it was really terrifying was when we were hitting the side of the ship and we thought that the boat would turn over because the water at 44 degrees or something like that, you don't last very long, and the waves were so high.
There were mixed reviews for the captain's performance through all this, but no kudos at all for the 106 Indonesian crew members, who passengers said clambered into lifeboats first.
There was a bunch of fellas from the band on the boat, and they were all lined around the rail where they shouldn't be. And then when he said to the abandoned ship, a bunch of the crew members, this is the Indonesian crew members, and this band bunch, they just jumped right in and nobody else could get near the boat. When the helicopters eventually came, which was about 11 hours later, you know who was first off the boat. And we couldn't keep them, and so Cora said, "Let them go, we're better off without them, get them out of here." That was the band, this crew and the band. But it was terrible. They were walking all over the little old ladies, and it was a shame.
The flares and things are either whether they're written in English and they can't read it, and they didn't know how to use them anyway. They had had no training in this. They didn't know how to release us from the boat. They didn't know how to start the oars.
The crew, busy on the town volleyball court, showed no sign of concern over all this criticism, nor would anyone talk about the Prinsendam incident. By the time the passengers arrived at the Valdez airport for the last leg of their journey, they seemed equally uninterested in dissecting it. As one man said, "Let them figure it out. I just want to get out of here." Susan Spencer, CBS News, Valdez, Alaska.
While it looked like the fire was dying out, and indeed it was. But late yesterday, something happened. Most likely, what few flames there were spread to the ship's fuel tanks, igniting them, resulting in a new fire. So today, the Prinsendam, which set out last week as a luxurious slow boat to China and other Asian ports, today the cruise ship remains dead in the water, going nowhere. The ship's captain, Cornelius Verbeke, a Dutchman, prepared yesterday to fly out to his ship to take command again. This time, however, the ship was to be towed southward toward Washington State for repairs. But Captain Verbeke had to return, high waves forcing postponement of the towing operation even before the new fire broke out. Earlier yesterday in Sitka, a small fishing village on the Alaskan Gulf, a former captain of the Prinsendam and now an official with the Holland America Line talked about the first fire last weekend that began in the engine room and forced more than 500 passengers and crew to abandon ship.
We closed it off and sealed it off right away, the engine room. Let in the gas, the fire extinguisher and CO2 gas. And from that time on, the fire in the engine room started simmering down. But of course, there was heat conveyance from the engine room casing, and that must have caused maybe curtains or whatever in the dining room just by heat conveyance to catch fire, and that's how it got outside the engine room.
As for this new fire, it is not clear how long it will burn, but until it is out, the once luxury liner Prinsendam is just drifting in the Gulf of Alaska. Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Anchorage.
Good morning, everyone. The luxury liner Prinsendam is adrift and abandoned off the coast of Alaska this morning with a fire still burning below deck. But all aboard, more than 500 passengers and crew, are now safely ashore after a dramatic rescue. What was to have been a voyage to the South Seas ended suddenly in frigid Alaskan waters early Saturday morning. Irv Chapman has details.
The
Dutch cruise vessel Prinsendam, after sightseeing in Alaskan waters, headed across the Pacific when its engine room caught fire. The fire spread. The ship was ordered abandoned. Passengers took to lifeboats in the bitter chill, monitored by Coast Guard helicopters. An oil tanker, which had loaded up in Alaska and was headed south to Texas, diverted to the scene, rescued nearly 400 of the passengers, brought them to the oil port of Valdez. A smaller group was brought by Coast Guard cutter to the port of Sitka. Some of the passengers spent 10 hours in lifeboats in the choppy seas and 24 more hours in the overcrowded crew quarters of the oil tanker. One young passenger broke his leg in the evacuation.
I was climbing up the side of the ship and slammed my ankle against the ship and I fell.
Their journey to the sunny seas of Southeast Asia aborted. The passengers will now be flown home. The cause of the fire will be investigated after it can be put out. Herb Chapman, ABC News.
Coast Guard crews are keeping their distance from the burning luxury liner Prinsendam this morning. Firefighters planning to go aboard decided not to because of dense smoke, indicating the blaze that forced all aboard to abandon ship 3 days ago may have spread to the fuel tanks. The ship is still drifting aimlessly this morning in rough seas in the Gulf of Alaska. For the passengers, now safe, dry, and heading for home, it's a day for reflecting on new friends found and material goods lost. Susan Spencer reports.
The Prinsendam passengers allowed themselves a few sentimental moments in the Valdez airport gift shop before leaving for Anchorage. A few moments at a place none of them ever expected to see just 3 days ago. They boarded the flight carrying their by now well-worn plastic shopping bags, the only luggage they have had since they fled the burning liner in the middle of the night. At Anchorage, Holland America officials passed out tickets to Seattle, forms asking, among other things, how much cash and what valuables they'd left on board, and some walking around money.
Yeah, that'll get me home, $40 camp fare. But what about from LAX to San Diego?
We're going to give you a ticket.
We just need a picture of getting. You're sure that?
And if we don't, we'll give us some more money.
Going over the details of the accident again and again seems to be a part of getting over it. That and sharing the experience with fellow passengers, the only ones who will ever really know what it was like. A lot of friendships were made on the rescue tanker Williamsburg.
When we were picked up, I had my nightgown on and a robe. They gave me the pants. Yes. That's what I said, souvenir.
The Prinsendam passengers will split up in Seattle to continue on home today. The cruise having been, just like the brochures always predict, an experience you'll never forget. Susan Spencer, CBS News, Anchorage, Alaska.
A Coast Guard officer called it a miracle, the rescue without loss of life, without serious injury of 533 people from lifeboats in the Gulf of Alaska. A fire had forced them off their cruise ship, Prinsendam, and they had bobbed about in the cold and wet for hours, one boatload for 17 hours, before helicopters found them. Today they were in port, safe and warm, in Sitka and Valdez. A report from David Burrington.
The abandoned liner still smoldered today. Coast Guard fire experts tried to board it to decide if it could be towed to port. Most of the passengers and crew arrived in Valdez last night on this tanker, and with the rescue completed, there are many questions. Why no sprinkler system in the engine room? Why so much confusion? Many of those rescued are elderly and spent some 15 hours in lifeboats in bad weather. And doctors were astonished they came through the ordeal as well as they did.
Welcome to Valdez, Alaska.
All were thankful to be alive, but some were bitter.
The lifeboats were overcrowded, terribly overcrowded, and that was frightening because we saw the capacity as 48, and some of the boats had 60, 80 people on them.
The crew was not of any help, and so I was a rower, and there were other women and a few men in the center, and we just rowed for our lives. I really thought at that point we wouldn't make it.
Other complaints: after hours on deck, they were told the fire was under control. Then suddenly abandoned ship. Crewmen were housed separately in a local high school. They did not care to answer questions. Passengers accused some of pushing ahead into the lifeboats, and a number of passengers say they will sue the line for damages. Of all the passengers and crew arriving here, only 15 were examined at the hospital and only 4 kept overnight. Nothing serious except the financial loss. symbolized for one man by his room key.
It doesn't look like much, but to us, it's worth thousands and thousands of dollars. That's what it cost us. Everything we had is completely lost. What I'm wearing is what I have left.
This morning, the rescued passengers had a leisurely breakfast. Some went shopping for clothes to tide them over. Then they were flown to Anchorage to catch planes back home. David Burrington, NBC News, Valdez.
There's some good news this morning. More than 500 people, many of them elderly, are now back on land after abandoning the burning cruise ship, the Prinsendam, in the Gulf of Alaska. More on the heroic, dramatic rescue from David Burrington.
For most of the passengers and crew, this was the dismal end of a luxury cruise to the Orient. But it could have been a lot worse. All aboard the supertanker Williamsburg were in good shape. As the tanker docked in the port of Valdez, an ambulance was standing by, but it was not needed, Coast Guard officials said.
How you folks doing, okay?
Most of the passengers are elderly and had to be helped. Many had no coats, and there were few umbrellas for the rain. Cameramen were kept at a distance as the passengers came off the ship some 36 hours after their ordeal began. Some had spent up to 15 hours in lifeboats. There was more delay here as officials pondered what to do about the Dutch crewmen who had no visas to enter the United States. The passengers spent the night in Valdez, jamming up all hotels in this tiny town. From here, everyone's to be taken to Anchorage for some rest. Then they'll start heading back to their hometowns to tell friends and neighbors of their extraordinary adventure. David Burrington, NBC News in Valdez.
And in the Seattle studios of King Television this morning, we have NBC's Bill Sternoff with two of the survivors, Louise Steele of Worcester, Massachusetts, Bill Powell of Laguna Beach, California. Good morning and welcome home.
Good morning, Tom. I guess first we should say NBC News, Mrs. Steele, has located your husband in Valdez. He did arrive on the oil tanker, and you, however, were flown out of the Gulf of Alaska. How is it that each and every one of you managed to be lifted out of that Gulf?
Well, it was done by the Coast Guard, as you know, and they took us out in baskets, one at a time. They lifted us into the plane. And the reason I was separated from my husband is because the plane was running out, the Coast Guard plane was running out of fuel and had to head back for their station. So my husband was left behind and was eventually taken aboard the freighter.
Were you scared when you left the ship? This happened in darkness in the middle of the night.
I must say I was not frightened, and people didn't appear to be frightened.
Nobody panicked?
Nobody panicked.
Nobody cried?
Nobody cried.
How so?
It's a very strange thing. I don't understand.
What were the sea conditions there, and how did they change as the day went on?
When we left the ship at approximately 4 in the morning, the sea was quite calm. But after we'd been in the water for about 3 hours, and before we saw any help in sight, the seas got heavier again.
Mr. Powell, this happened just 3 days into a tour that might have taken more than a month at a cost of $6,000 to $12,000 for each of the participants. What if this would have happened on the 4th day, or the 5th day, or the 6th day out? What then?
Well, I can only tell you what the Coast Guard mentioned to me, that it could have been completely disastrous if we had been any further out.
That's because you would have been completely out to sea.
Right. As it was, we were 150 miles out from the land.
Did you find this a scary experience?
Yes, it was something that I don't care to repeat ever again. It was scary. Very
You were on the Coast Guard cutter the Boutwell, which lifted out the last people from the Gulf.
That's right.
And then you were taken into Sitka, Alaska.
That's correct.
We hear that there was some sort of commotion on the ship, that some of the crewmen seemed to rush the lifeboats. Is that right?
Well, I don't really care to elaborate on that. You see, there was a staff and there were crewmen. The staff was Dutch, the crewmen were Indonesian. And I think possibly the Indonesians were scared.
Mrs. Steele, many of the people on this ship were elderly. Didn't this work a particularly difficult time for them?
You might have thought so, but everybody seemed to manage very well, even the people who were in wheelchairs.
There you were in the Gulf of Alaska. It was dark, it was cloudy, it was foggy, the seas were growing rough, and suddenly you saw the oil tanker.
Well, that wasn't until we had been in the water for 3 hours.
What was your reaction?
Well, it was like seeing a mirage, a sparkling, beautiful sight. But it turned out to be a very large tanker.
Well, you're both very lucky, of course, to be here, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. Tom?
Turned out luxury liner Prinsendam are safe and ashore in Alaska. The talk of a ceasefire between Iraq and Iran has been drowned out by gunfire. About that near disaster at sea, many came ashore with tales of a night to remember. For 20, though, the tale of the day they were almost forgotten. The 20 were 18 evacuees and 2 Air Force paramedics who drifted for hours in high seas in their life raft until someone discovered they were still missing. Now all the passengers and crew are accounted for, and the last of them are back on land this morning. Susan Spencer reports from Valdez, Alaska.
The oil tanker Williamsburg lumbered into Valdez Harbor in the evening mist. Its unexpected cargo of 359 stranded cruise passengers by now accustomed to the drone of television reporters' helicopters overhead. The luxury ship they fled in the middle of the night lay listing helplessly in the Gulf of Alaska. No way to tell, Holland America officials said, if it can be salvaged. No explanation of why the fire could not be contained or of how it started. As the passengers headed home, National Guard cargo planes brought emergency Red Cross equipment, tennis shoes, blankets, cots, to be set up wherever space could be found, at a construction camp unused since pipeline days, in banquet rooms at Valdez's 5 hotels. Among the first off the ship, the radio operator who took the Prinsendam's distress call. Tell me what you heard from the Prinsendam.
Oh, just SOS, SOS. This is the Prinsendam, and passenger ship on fire, engine rooms on fire, and situation unknown.
As darkness fell, the passengers, some still in their pajamas, many elderly, and all weary, slowly made their way to waiting buses.
I was on it about 9.5 hours, but I never feared for my life. There were always the above, over the lifeboat, watching us, and I knew we'd be saved.
We got into the lifeboats, but they were slightly overloaded. We can't say enough about the Air Force and Coast Guard.
Plans now depend a lot on the ever-inclement Alaska weather. If possible, Holland America will land 737 jets here tomorrow to take passengers to Anchorage, where they will begin the last leg of their exhausting journey home. Susan Spencer, CBS News, Valdez, Alaska.
The Coast Guard can only watch as the cruise ship, the Prinsendam, continues to burn and drift in the Gulf of Alaska this morning. Heavy black smoke is keeping anyone from boarding the luxury liner. At the same time, reunions continue among the passengers who abandoned her. Here's Bill Sternoff.
The first of 2 groups of survivors to reach Seattle came in from Sitka, Alaska. The people were anxious to be reunited with friends and relatives who became separated Saturday during the day-long rescue at sea. Some survivors had been airlifted directly to Sitka or were taken there aboard a Coast Guard cutter. Others, put aboard an oil tanker, were taken to Valdez. Husbands were separated from wives, parents from children, and many said they wouldn't believe their loved ones were safe until they were back together.
My last name's Corey, and I'm trying to find my mother. I thought she'd be here.
The reunions came when the second group of survivors arrived shortly after midnight.
Here you are. Here's your son.
I have something for you.
Oh, really? I have something for you,
For Dick and Louise Steele, the reunion was a dream and the end of a nightmare.
The last I saw of Mrs. Steele was her disappearing into the helicopter in the baskets.
I just had the departure time of the next flight there. You can.
The Steeles and all the other survivors from the cruise ship Prinsendam were given hotel rooms and airline tickets, and most will leave for home this morning. Bill Sternoff, NBC News, Seattle.
Time now to take a look at the latest news. In one of the most extraordinary rescue operations in history, every passenger and every crew member of that Dutch cruise ship, the Prinsendam, has been brought safely to land in Alaska and the state of Washington. More than 500 people altogether. The Coast Guard picked them up with helicopters from lifeboats 150 miles at sea and put them aboard an oil tanker and a Coast Guard cutter. A few of the survivors already are in Seattle, where NBC's Bill Cernoff talked with two of them during the first hour of today in the studios of King, K-I-N-G TV in Seattle. They are Bill Powell of Laguna Beach, California, and Louise Steele of Worcester, Massachusetts. She described her reactions.
Say I was not frightened, and people didn't appear to be frightened.
Nobody panicked?
Nobody panicked.
Nobody cried?
Nobody cried.
How so?
It's a very strange thing I don't understand.
It was dark, it was cloudy, it was foggy, the seas were growing rough, and suddenly you saw the oil tanker.
Well, that wasn't until we had been in the water for 3 hours.
What was your reaction?
Well, it was like seeing a mirage, a sparkling, beautiful sight. It turned out to be a very large tanker.